Hey everyone. So I've been watching some Melanie Phillips lately. If you're not familiar with her, she's one of the clearest thinkers in the English speaking world on the intersection of Islam, the West, Israel, all the issues, a lot of the issues I talk about on this channel. She's been right about almost everything, often decades before anyone else caught up. And I want to pull out three specific moments from her most recent conversation with Brendan O'Neill. Each one is brilliant on its own, but I think each one points to something even deeper that I want to unpack. So let's get right to it. Let's pull up Melanie Phillips and let's go to clip number 1. Here we go.
In this ostensibly the most rational age ever known to man, what we're looking through is a complete eclipse of reason and rationality. And how can that possibly be when everyone's now so well educated relative to what they were? Well, the answer, I think, comes back to what happened more than half a century ago, which is that in the universities, in the academy, in the intelligentsia, the idea of objective truth was simply abolished. From that point, everything became a matter of opinion. If there was no truth, there were no lies. If you said something was a lie, well, that was just your opinion. And if you are somebody that I disapprove of, then your opinion is worthless. It's like that. That's what's happened. And so, if you abolish truth, you abolish reason. If you abolish reason, you get the embrace of lies. And if you get the embrace of lies, you have a society which comes off the moral guardrails completely, and goes hurtling into a kind of anarchy of behavior, both on the streets, as we increasingly see, and in people's minds. There is no moral compass anymore.
All right. So let's unpack that a bit. So Melanie Phillips just identified something very crucial. The abolition of objective truth in the Western Academy, beginning about half a century ago, produced a cascade of consequences, of results that we're now living through, right? As she says, no truth means no lies means no reason means moral freefall. She's right. And I want to build on it precisely because I think there are actually two parallel collapses happening simultaneously. And they're related, but they're not identical. The first is the one that Melanie describes, the collapse of objective truth, the postmodern claim that facts are not real, that what we call truth is just power dressed up as reality, that there's no view from nowhere. Like every view is equally valid. That knowledge itself is a political construct. We're seeing this in the postmodern world. The second is the collapse of objective good and evil, which she's pointing to, but she doesn't say here. The claim running through Marxist thought for over a century that morality is not real either, that what we call good and evil are also just power constructs, power dressed up in moral language, that the only real categories are power categories, are oppressor and oppressed, which also leads to a world where everyone is only acting in their own self-interest, right? Because there's no good or evil anymore. There's only oppressor and oppressed. There's only power relationships. Now, these are related, but they're not the same point. Like truth is an epistemological category. It's about what is real and what can be known. That's what I mean by that. Good, on the other hand, is a moral category. It's about what is right and what ought to be done. They both depend on a belief in absolutes, right? So Phillips, in this clip, Melanie Phillips is talking about the first of these two. I want to add the second because I think that both of the collapses, the collapse of truth versus falsehood, that construct, and good versus evil, both of those collapses, they flow from the same root. And here's the root. Biblical civilization makes two foundational claims simultaneously. One is that, well, reality is real. The world exists independently of what any power would say it is, right? Facts are facts. Truth is truth. Human beings are made in the image of God, and they have the capacity to perceive reality accurately. And the second is that good and evil are real. Right from the creation story. Morality is not a construct that comes later. It's not whatever the powerful say it is. Good and evil are objective features of reality flowing from the nature of God himself. And human beings have the capacity to know them. They flow from God, but they aren't identical with God. And we'll get to that soon. Very important point. Now, what grounds both of these claims is the same thing. The nature of God as the source, as a source of truth and goodness. Truth and good. And the nature of man as an image bearer, the bearer of the image of God, equipped to perceive and interact with both. In the biblical framework, in the biblical mindset, right, you can know what is true and you can know what is right. There are categories: true, false, good, evil. And you can know them not because God has told you, not because an authority has told you, but because God, by creating us in his image and giving us free will, part of that free will, part of what God imbued us with, is the ability to perceive reality and to understand reality and to read it. I'm going to explain this. Let me get what I'm getting at. When you look at the two great anti-biblical forces of our time, anti-biblical forces, and I've talked about this a lot, postmodern atheistic progressivism and Islamic political theology, right? Both of them disagree with the biblical constructs, both of truth and of good versus evil, but they do it from opposite directions. Postmodern progressivism abolishes objective truth by denying God, but by denying any absolutes. If there's no God, there's no ground for saying reality is structured in a way that human beings can reliably know. So we can't really know truth. And if there's no transcendent moral order, which certainly the progressive atheist left doesn't believe in an absolute moral order, then there's no ground for objective good and evil either. Okay, and then what you're left with is just power relationships and what hurts me. And the most basic definition of what is good for me as a person, or what is good for people, which is why like offense culture and like all suffering is equal and right, all of this, that's what it stems from, that there's no objective good and evil. So therefore, it all goes down to power. The framework they're operating in has no category for this is objectively wrong. It only has a category for whose side are you on. When you play out these constructs politically. Islamist theology takes a completely different route, but arrives at a structurally similar place. And this is a point I've tried to tease out in a few videos. I'm actually going to be starting a larger project of writing about this because I think it's a very important point. Let me say it again. Islamist theology arrives at a structurally similar place. It doesn't deny God, but it makes God the only source of both truth and goodness. And you may think, well, I believe in the God of the Bible. He's also the only source of truth and goodness. Not exactly. Let me explain. Of course, he's the source of everything. But let me explain the difference between how we see truth and good, truth and the good versus Islam. In Islam, both the good and truth are outside the realm of human reason and human accountability. Good is defined as whatever Allah commands. Evil is whatever Allah forbids. There's no standard above the divine will that human beings can invoke. This was best stated by Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the most influential Islamist political thinker of the 20th century. And he stated this with complete explicitness. I'm going to read this slowly because I want you to hear every word. This is a quote. He said like this, quote, "We know of no absolute values besides total submission to the will of the Almighty. People say don't lie, but the principle is different when we serve the will of Allah. He taught man to lie so that we can save ourselves at moments of difficulty and confuse our enemies. Should we remain truthful at the cost of defeat and danger to the faith? We say no. People say don't kill, but the Almighty himself taught us how to kill. And then, and this is the line I want you to sit with, quote, listen to this, this is amazing. Deceit, trickery, conspiracy, cheating, stealing, and killing are nothing but means. On their own, they are neither good nor evil. For no deed is either good or bad, isolated from the intentions that motivated it. Okay, this is the founder of the Islamic Republic writing his doctrine. And this is a quote from Amir Taheri's book, Holy Terror. He quotes Khomeini there. I don't read Arabic or Persian, whatever language he wrote in. What Khomeini is describing is the precise logical conclusion of what we're going to call divine command theory. If good is whatever Allah commands and evil is whatever Allah forbids, then there's no objective moral standard that a human being can divine for themselves, can intuit for themselves. It's not part of how you're not seeing the world through a lens of a concept of good and good things and what is good and what is evil. There's no objective moral standard above the divine will. If that's the case, then that's Khomeini. No deed is good or bad in itself. It's only its service to the cause being Allah and whatever Allah wants in the world. That's the only measure of whether a deed is good or bad. That's what Khomeini is saying. And this isn't a distortion of Islamist theology. This is a direct application of it. This is it. Now contrast that with the biblical framework. And I want to be precise here because the contrast is sharper than most people realize. The Bible contains two moments that I think are the most philosophically radical statements in the Bible. The first is in Genesis 18, where God is about to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham, in arguing with God, says, "Shall the judge of all the earth not do justice?" And similarly, in Exodus chapter 5, after Pharaoh makes the Israelites' suffering worse after Moses first comes to Pharaoh, Moses turns to God and says, "Why have you done evil to this people?" Hebrew, lama hareota. Why have you done evil to this people? Now, here's what I want you to notice. And this is not about God being gracious enough not to strike them down for arguing. That's not the point. The point is this. These arguments only make sense, what Moses says to God, what Abraham says to God, they only make sense if the concept of justice and the concept of evil means something independent of the divine command. Think about it. There's no commandments yet. But not only that, if God is the sole definer of justice, if that's the definition of what is just or what is good, is whatever God decides. So if justice simply means whatever God does, then Abraham's accusation is not just wrong, it's incoherent. It makes no sense. You can't say the sole definer of justice is being unjust. It's not an argument. It's self-contradictory. The sentence has no meaning. If evil simply means what God forbids, if God cannot by definition do evil because the very definition of evil is whatever God prohibits, then Moses' accusation, "Why have you done evil?" is impossible. If Moses was working with a concept that evil is whatever God doesn't want and good is whatever God wants, or evil is whatever, good is whatever God does, no matter what it is, like Khomeini says, then he wouldn't have even asked the question. You can't just accuse the sole definer of evil of doing evil. It's nonsense, unless justice is a real thing. Unless evil and good are real things. They're objective features of reality that exist independently of what anyone decides to call them, human or divine. That God gave us the ability to discern intuitively good and evil, truth and falsehood. Unless both Abraham and Moses are operating within a shared moral framework that they did not create, and God, Abraham, Moses, and God, they have to all be operating within that shared moral framework. And then these conversations make sense. So I hope this point is clear. What the biblical text presupposes is that there is such a thing as good, there's such a thing as evil, there's such a thing as truth. Like God doesn't say to them, you're confused, I define justice, so whatever I do is just by definition. That's not his answer to Abraham. In the biblical framework, these are coherent claims. They're appeals to something real. And this is the foundation on which everything in Western civilization is built. Even in these conversations, you see already the beginnings of what we call the covenantal relationship versus the submission relationship. That's what I like to call it in the comparison between the biblical relationship to God and the Islamic one. Covenantal relationship to God empowers the human being to interact with God, to be his partner, to be his agent. Free speech is a biblical concept because truth is real and worth defending. The rule of law because justice is real. The prophetic tradition because power can be held to a standard above itself. So the prophets rebuking the kings. Science emerges from a biblical worldview because reality is intelligible to us and investigation is worthwhile. The very concept of human rights comes from a biblical worldview because good and evil are real and human beings can understand them and apply them. When you remove that foundation, whether you remove it from below, as postmodernism does, by denying that an objective reality exists, or whether you remove it from above, as Muslim divine command theory does, by placing all moral reality entirely inside the inscrutable will of God, and you end up in the same place. A world where the only question is not, is this right? But does this serve the higher cause? That's Khomeini's world. And that's increasingly the world that we find ourselves in. Phillips sees the collapse of truth and traces its consequences with clarity here. And what I'm adding is that running alongside the collapse of truth is the collapse of good and evil. And you cannot rebuild one without rebuilding the other. Okay, that's the first clip. My other comments are somewhat shorter. Let's go to clip number 2 now. Clip number 2.
In fact, they're kind of interchangeable. And they've hooked up with Islamists to basically bring about two things. I mean, it is quite comical given that the Islamists, given that people on the left have certain causes dear to their hearts, such as, for example, gay rights. And, the Islamists would have their head off their shoulders in a trice in other circumstances. But they're marching shoulder to shoulder because they're united by two things: a desire to bring down the West and Western civilization, even though they have completely diametrically opposite views about what they want to replace it with, and their hatred of Jews. Their hatred.
Okay. So what's she saying here? She's talking about the Red-Green Alliance, the left wing and the Islamists marching together, what we were just talking about, people who claim to believe in gay rights, women's rights, secularism. As Phillips puts it, they'd have their heads off their shoulders in other circumstances. And her explanation is correct as far as it goes. They want to bring down the West. They hate Jews in Israel. But now that you understand what we just talked about, the collapse of objective good and evil, the framework that has no category for this is wrong, but only asks the question, are you with us or against us? When you look at it that way, then the alliance between the left and the Muslims stops being a mystery. It's not this strange alliance anymore, because both movements are operating inside the exact same framework, the same moral framework. Marxist progressive ideology gets there through atheism: no God, no transcendent moral standard, no objective good and evil, only oppressor and oppressed. You're either on the side of liberation or you're the enemy. And Islamist political theology gets there through divine command theory. You just heard Khomeini say it, right? No deed is good or bad in itself, only its service to the cause gives it moral content. So it's different theologies, completely different ultimate visions, but the answer to the question, what is good? Good is whatever serves the cause. And once you're operating inside that framework, the alliance is natural. You don't need to agree on what your end goal is. As she says, they have different goals about what to replace Western society with. You just need to agree on what you're tearing down, who you hate. Now, why the Jews? Why is Jew hatred the thing that unites them? Because the Jewish people are not just a nation with a state. They're the living embodiment of a civilization that both of these worldviews are committed to dismantling. Right? The Jewish civilization says that good and evil are real, that human beings have inherent dignity. By the way, that's part of what's going on in this whole war, where Israel keeps saying, listen, we are fighting evil. And the world's sort of like not hearing it. Israel's not targeted because of what it does. Israel's targeted because of what it is. It is a Jewish state in the Jewish homeland, exactly as the prophets described, built on biblical foundations of law and human dignity. It's a living refutation of both the atheist Marxists and the Islamists, their worldviews. It has to be opposed by them, not as a policy matter, but as an existential matter. They have to hate Israel. Phillips is right that the hatred of Jews unites them, but the hatred is downstream of something much deeper, right? It's the inevitable consequence of these two worldviews that cannot tolerate the civilization, the nation state of the Jewish people, which brings us to clip number 3.
That where it's coming from is a position of, I think, justified pain.
Yeah, I think the great irony is that, what I think these people need is not an ethno state, not that kind of racial utopia that they dream about, but something like Zionism, the thing that they hate, by which I mean a sense of national confidence, a sense of peoplehood, a sense of historical consciousness. If they spent less time raging against the sins of Zionism and more time thinking, well, what does that really mean? What does that represent? What does it mean to have such a strong sense of peoplehood? Then I think they could learn a lot from it.
All right, so this one isn't a clip of Melanie, it's a clip of Brendan. But I think what he said here is super, super profound. So Brendan just said something. I think it's one of the most insightful things I've heard in this entire discussion. And I want to take it further. He's pointing at something even bigger than he realizes. He's talking about the nationalist right, like in America, the MAGA isolationists, right? The people who feel that their civilization is being taken from them. And there's a lot of justification. There's a lot of, as Melanie said at the beginning, there's a lot of justification for how they feel. But they romanticize part of the whole ethos of that worldview, especially on the right in the conservative world. They romanticize a certain kind of society, right? Traditional families, people getting married young and building families, men who fight for their families, a masculine, culture, a culture with a clear sense of identity and purpose. And what Brendan is saying here is the thing you're looking for, it's called Zionism. Go study it. So he's right, but let me make it concrete. So a good friend of mine, who many of you know from his work on critical theory and the ideological capture of Western institutions, Dr. James Lindsay. James Lindsay visited Israel for the first time last year. He's been here a couple times in the last year and a half. And he said something to me that I haven't been able to get out of my head. We had a whole conversation about it. But basically what he said was, Israeli society is everything that these nationalists, these on the MAGA right, say that they admire. And I say national, I mean like, what the MAGA right says that they admire and want to be, especially in the younger generation. Israeli society is everything that they admire and want to be, but are not. It's an amazing observation from someone who really understands that world. So let me tell you what Israeli society actually looks like. Not from the outside, not from a think tank report, but from someone who's lived here for 30 plus years, and have raised 8 children to adulthood in this country. In Israel, people marry young. They build families, large ones. Israel has the highest birth rate of any developed, of Western nations, Western developed nations. And it's not just because of the ultra-Orthodox. Even the secular Israelis have larger families than what you see in the West. They're joyful. Israel is one of the happiest countries of the world. Look up the happiness index, which is a real thing. Men serve in the army, not reluctantly, not because they have no choice, but because they understand they're defending something sacred, something their fathers defended, their grandfathers, and their sons will defend after them. There's a thread of obligation and purpose running through Israeli society that the progressive West has almost entirely lost. And here's the thing that'll surprise you if you've been following Western political trends. In Israel, the stereotype of a leftist is an old person. Stereotype. The young people trend more conservative, more right-wing, and that trend has been strengthening for over a generation. That's why we haven't had a left-wing government, a left-wing prime minister in a long time. The major left-wing parties have shrunk considerably over the last generation. The society is not drifting left as it modernizes, which is a bit of an anomaly. It's moving right as it modernizes. The children of the Mizrahi and Sephardic Jewish communities, the religious communities who marry young, they build large families, they serve in the army proudly, they vote conservative. They're becoming the demographic heart of this country. The left here is literally aging out. The future belongs to conservatives. And I don't say this as an outside observer. Like I said, I've raised 8 children to adulthood in Israel. I've watched the society for 30 plus years. The leftists here are the older people. The young people are, like I said, building families. That's the opposite of what the progressive West keeps telling us about itself. Now, why? Why does Israel have what the nationalist right is searching for? Why has this society held together, grown stronger, trended more conservative, maintained its will to fight, its desire to build families, while the Western societies that claim to represent civilization's future are demographically collapsing? The answer is not ethnic nationalism. It's not that Jews are a special race with special qualities. The answer is covenant. Biblical covenant doesn't just produce freedom. It produces responsibility. The concept of covenant means that we're all responsible. It doesn't just empower individuals. It binds them to something larger than themselves, to their families, to their communities, to their nation, to a purpose that stretches back thousands of years and forward into generations to come. When an Israeli soldier picks up his gun, he's not just defending a piece of land. He's standing in a line that goes back to Joshua, to the Maccabees, to Bar Kokhba, to the defenders of Tel Chai. He knows the story he's a part of. He knows what he's defending. He knows why it matters. And that's what a covenant does to a people. It gives them a story. It gives them stakes. It gives them meaning and a reason to build families and fight. That's what Zionism actually is. It's not an ethnic project. It's not a colonial enterprise. It's the fulfillment of a biblical covenant, a people returning to their ancient homeland after 2,000 years of exile, exactly as the prophets described. The same language, the same land, the same people, speaking the language their ancestors prayed in, studied in, wrote in throughout that history, practicing the same faith. And that's why our enemies can't tolerate it, not because of what Israel does, but because of what Israel is, a living, breathing, geopolitical proof that biblical civilization works, that a society built on covenantal responsibility, on genuine freedom and genuine responsibility, on the image of God in every person and the obligation that carries. And a society built on these values can survive and thrive and go stronger under pressure and can produce exactly the kind of society that these desperate, searching, aching nationalists on the right who are now turning on Israel say they want and can't seem to build for themselves. I hope they do. I pray they do. So to the MAGA nationalists, and I love MAGA, and I mean those who have turned on Israel in the group, who wave the flag of Western civilization and traditional values and the will to fight, but they've somehow, to you who have somehow ended up on the wrong side of the one country that embodies all of those things, you're not rejecting your enemy. You're rejecting the model that you should look to. You're rejecting the evidence that what you say you want is actually possible in the modern age. Go to Israel, walk around, watch the young families, watch the soldiers, watch the religious communities bursting with children and purpose and life. Talk to young people who trend right, not because they were told to, but because they've lived with real stakes and real meaning and real obligation, and they've chosen it. and then come back and tell me that Zionism has nothing to teach you. So those are the three clips where Melanie Phillips and Brendan O'Neill really share important points. Just to sum up, the abolition of truth is not just a cultural catastrophe. It's the consequence of abandoning the biblical foundation that makes both objective truth and objective good and evil possible simultaneously. The red-green alliance is not just a shared hatred. It's a natural convergence of two worldviews that share a common framework and a common enemy. That Khomeini quote. And what the nationalist right is searching for is not an ethno-state, it's a covenantal civilization. And that civilization already exists. It was built on the Bible, and its proof of concept is living and thriving and growing more conservative in every generation in the land of Israel right now. And frankly, America used to be that way too. Anyway, I hope you found this useful and interesting. I know it went on a bit long. Thanks for watching. Please share, like, subscribe, do all that stuff. Please tell others what we're doing on this channel, and God bless.